we were discussing a while ago the principle of social justice, and I defined it in accord with the classical definition given by Justice Laurel. Now, in the meantime, may I tell you that the basis of police power are also the basis of social justice. If you try to remember your study of police power, there are two Latin maxims that are the basis of police power, and also the basis of the principle of social justice. And these are the following: the principle of sic otere, tu ut alienum non leides, and this principle of that salus populi is suprema lex. In other words, when you talk of sic otere, tu ut alienum non leides, this simply means that no one shall injure the rights of others. In the case of salus populi est suprema lex, the welfare of the people is the first law. In other words, in the exercise of your rights, and in the process of asserting your right, you should also consider the rights of other people. And in the process, you should not injure or damage the rights of other people. You may have the right to, shall we say, drive your car, but it's not your right to run over a pedestrian. That's also the basis of social justice. Say, for instance, if you group yourselves into a residential association, you squat in somebody else's property. By the time that you were evicted out by the employer who said you are protected by social justice, according to the Supreme Court, this is not social justice. It is a misplaced social justice. Because according to the Supreme Court, in invoking social justice, you invoke social justice with your clean hands. And also, the Supreme Court further declared that social justice is never a refuge of scoundrels. Of course, neither it is a refuge of nincompoops. So take note of these people. Another basis is this salus populi est suprema lex, which simply means the welfare of the people is the first law. Take note that the target of social justice is the downtrodden, the poor people, the indigents, the destitute. In other words, the target of social justice is the common tao. And what is the purpose of social justice? The purpose lies on the fact that those who have less in life should have more in law. In other words, those who are in the lower bracket of the society should be given the opportunity to be given the social and economic upliftment through laws enacted by Congress. So this is actually the essence of the principle of social justice. In the meantime, may I tell you one case where the Supreme Court applied this principle of social justice. There was an old case where the Supreme Court said that in the case of an employee who was illegally dismissed and was reinstated in the payroll pending appeal, where the labor arbiter decided for him, the NLRC decided for him, the Court of Appeals decided for him, meaning to say these bodies declared that there was illegal dismissal. But when the case reached the Supreme Court said, the Supreme Court found legal dismissal. In other words, the dismissal of a worker or an employee was for a just cause, for a valid cause. Now, the question is whether or not this worker reinstated in the payroll should reimburse or refund all the salaries he received pending appeal. Under the old case, the Supreme Court said that these workers should refund to the employer. Otherwise, it would be violative of the principle of unjust enrichment. But in 2009, another case was declared by the Supreme Court, pronounced by the Supreme Court, Garcia versus Pal, when the Supreme Court said that there is no more need for a refund of an employee whose dismissal was found to be legal by the Supreme Court. Because according to the Supreme Court, the principle of social justice renders ineffective, renders inapplicable the doctrine or principle of unjust enrichment. In other words, in this doctrine, the principle of social justice is superior over the principle of unjust enrichment. And that is a very important decision of the Supreme Court, because this might be given in the bar, maybe through an essay type question or by way of an MCQ. So take note of this. It is a very important area. Okay. So Article 2, then we go through Article 3 of the Constitution. Take note that we are still on provisions of the Constitution as affecting labor. So Article 3 is the Bill of Rights. And the most important of which is, of course, this Article 3, Section 1, which provides, no person shall be deprived of his life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied the equal protection of the law. By the way, in the enumeration of life, liberty, or property, what is more intimated, affiliated with the concept of labor? According to the Supreme Court, the right to labor is property. So it's the right to property. The right to labor is property within the mantle of constitutional protection. In other words, it's not life, it's not liberty, but it's property. Because according to the Supreme Court, the right to labor is property within the mantle of constitutional protection. So no one shall be deprived of his right to labor, which is property, without due process of law. By the way, this is known as the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. And what is the Latin basis of this Due Process Clause? It is based on the Latin maxim audier alteram partem, meaning no one shall be condemned unheard. In other words, this is the very concept of the due process as conceived in the Dartmouth College case. It hears first before it condemns. It proceeds from an inquiry before rendition of a final judgment. So no one shall be condemned unheard. Audier alteram partem. And from the point of view of labor, what is due process? Well, under the due process clause, we have the substantive due process and the procedural due process. And what is substantive due process? Substantive due process refers to the legality or illegality of the act of dismissal. On the other hand, procedural aspect refers to the legality or illegality of the manner of dismissal. In other words, under the substantive aspect, it simply means that no worker, no employee shall be dismissed except for causes provided by law. And what are, as a general rule, what are the two types of causes? We have the just causes and we have the authorized causes. And under these just causes and authorized causes, there are two types of dismissal. We have the just cause dismissal and we have the authorized cause dismissal. I mind you that the due process clause in relation to just causes and authorized causes are the fertile areas of the bar. Every year, this is an area of the bar. So listen very carefully, because about 30, 40, or 50% of the bar questions come from this area. So these are the fertile areas of bar questions. So listen. In other words, in just causes and authorized causes, there are two types: the just cause dismissal and the authorized cause dismissal. And there are three distinctions between the two, as differentiated by the Supreme Court in the case of Agapon versus LLC and this case of Jacafood versus Pacot. So what are these distinctions? Very important for purposes of MCQs. Very important. So number one distinction. In a just cause dismissal, the dismissal process is initiated by the employee. On the other hand, in the case of authorized cause dismissal, the dismissal process is initiated by the employer. In other words, people, in a just cause dismissal, such as what? Serious misconduct, willful disobedience or insubordination, fraud, willful breach of trust, gross and habitual neglect of duty, commission of a criminal offense against the employer, immediate members of his family, including managerial employees. And the last one, we have these analogous causes. On the other hand, initiated by the employer, we have automation, or otherwise known as introduction of labor-saving device. Number two, we have retrenchment or downsizing. In one case decided by the Supreme Court, retrenchment is also treated as a form of partial closure of business. So partial closure of business is also a form of retrenchment. Another, we have this redundancy. Take note that in redundancy, the Supreme Court said that there is no duplication of work functions. Another, we have this disease. And the last one, we have closure of business. Now, in the case of just causes, so under number one distinction, we have the just cause, initiated by the employee, authorized cause initiated by the employer. Number two distinction, in a just cause dismissal, as a rule, there is no payment of separation pay. However, if the offenses are serious misconduct or offenses that reflect moral character, there is no payment of separation pay. But for willful disobedience and others, there could be payment of separation pay. But in case of serious misconduct, in case of offenses involving or reflective moral character, no payment of separation pay. Now, in the case of authorized cause dismissal, the law mandates the payment of separation pay. And the last distinction, in a just cause dismissal, if for non-compliance, shall I say, for non-compliance of the due process requirement by the employer in a just cause dismissal, the law imposes indemnity or damages upon the employer, and the damages or indemnity is tempered. On the other hand, for non-compliance of the due process requirement in an authorized cause dismissal, the indemnity or damages imposed is different. In other words, people, in the case of just cause, tempered. In the case of authorized cause, it is different. All right, so listen very carefully. So let's analyze these people as far as just causes are concerned. So initiated by the employee, we have serious misconduct. In the case of serious misconduct, as defined by the Supreme Court, serious misconduct is a wrongful conduct. But this wrongful conduct was committed in an aggravated or serious manner. So if it were a minor misconduct, it is not a just cause for dismissal. What is contemplated under the Labor Code is a serious misconduct. Give examples of serious misconduct. In a litany of cases decided by the Supreme Court, there are serious misconducts that were declared as such by the Supreme Court. Like one? Well, in the case of sexual harassment. In one case, the Supreme Court said that sexual harassment is a form of serious misconduct. Take note that sexual harassment is an offense that reflects moral character. So there is no payment of separation pay here. Now, so in case of serious misconduct, in the case of sexual harassment, shall I say, here the employee or a student or a trainee is placed in an intimidating, hostile, offensive environment. In other words, there are two types of sexual harassment. Number one, quid pro quo. sexual harassment, and the other one is hostile environment. Under the first type of sexual harassment, quid pro quo, this is economic in nature. Because here, there is sexual procurement by the manager, by the employer. So it's economic in nature. Give an example. All right, I'm going to regularize your employment. Before, you were in a probationary status or a casual status. Now you're a regular employee. So there is a change. There is an upgrade of your salary. All right. In the case of a promotion, I'm going to promote you, but you know already what you are going to pay for me. Okay. Now in this instance, there is sexual procurement. At the same time, it's economic in nature, because finally, the worker here is given an additional wage or increase of salary. Economic in nature. But in the case of hostile environment, the employee is placed in an intimidating hostile environment, which, under such circumstances, compel an employee to resign. That's why, under this instance where an employee is compelled to resign because of such circumstances, she can file a letter of resignation, she can resign. Now question, can she file a case of constructive dismissal? Definitely yes. Why? Because contingent employment has become unreasonable or unfavorable or unbearable under the circumstances because of the sexual actuations of the employer or the managerial employee or the superior, as the case may be. So take note of these two types of sexual harassment. We have the quid pro quo. I give so that you may give. Scratch my back so that I can scratch yours. Bigayan. It's a concept of bandy, give and take. But in this particular case, it is an immoral act because of sexual procurement. So take note of this. Another is intimidating, hostile, offensive environment where the employee is compelled to resign and file a case of constructive dismissal because continued employment has become impossible, unreasonable, unlikely, unbearable, or unfavorable under the circumstances. So take note of these people, very important. Now, so that is other types of serious misconduct, like what? Well, in one case, the Supreme Court said that gambling, because of its pernicious effects upon the society, is a form of serious misconduct. You know well that because of gambling, many commit suicide. Yung iba nagpapatiwakal, tumatalon, etc. and so on and so forth. So, because of its pernicious effects, it's declared in the Supreme Court as a form of serious misconduct. Another is, of course, fighting in company premises. You know, fighting in company premises is declared serious misconduct by the Supreme Court. Because according to the Supreme Court, if there's fighting in company premises, it would likely disturb the workplace. So it is declared as serious misconduct by the Supreme Court. Another, well, immorality is also a form of serious misconduct. Perhaps you still remember an old case, the case of Montemayor, where this professor was dismissed for an immoral act. The professor invited the students, his students, to help him check papers in his rented room. But in his room, the professor checks upon his student. Oh my God. So actually, this is a case of immorality where the Supreme Court found legal dismissal. So he was dismissed. Well, of course, there is no immorality between a professor and a student, or a teacher and a student. Years apart, if both of them have the legal capacity to marry. Because according to the Supreme Court, as you know this already, which until now I cannot understand, because the heart has its own reason, which reason does not know. Oh my God. The heart has its own reason, which reason does not know. Be that as it may, that was the declaration of the Supreme Court. So, you know now, this serious misconduct. Theft is also a form of serious misconduct. It is an act of dishonesty. But you have to be very careful on whether or not you have to dismiss an employee because of theft. Because there were cases decided by the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court considered dismissal as too harsh a punishment, considering length of service, considering the amount of the property taken is negligible. So if the amount of the property taken is negligible, according to the Supreme Court, dismissal is too harsh a penalty, or too harsh a punishment. You know, when I was the bar examiner in 2008, any statement or any answer of the bar examinee which touches on, sir, this is the dismissal is too harsh a punishment, sir. Dismissal is too harsh a penalty, sir. I would remember that perhaps this bar examiner is my student, was a former student, shall I say. So, of course, you have to consider, di mo maalis na estudyante mo ito nung una, mabigyan mo ng, you can give him, shall we say, a very reasonable grade, maybe higher than what he expects. By the way, so you have to consider the amount of the property taken. I'll give you a very concrete example. This is my usual example in the bar review program. Here is a panadera or baker, tagamasa ng harina. Alam ko, marunong kayo magmasa. Masarap magmasa ng harina. Okay. So, this baker, employed by the bakery for about 15 years already. One time he was caught stealing 15 pieces of pandesal. 15 years of service, he stole 15 pieces of pandesal. Perhaps, magkano yung 15 pieces of pandesal? Perhaps about 75 pesos. So what happened? He was dismissed. Is dismissal proper? Following the doctrine laid down by the Supreme Court that you have to consider the amount of the property taken in the case of theft, it seems that the amount, 75 pesos, is negligible. Meaning to say that it does not, shall we say, correspond, it is not proportionate to the offense committed, considering perhaps his length of service and considering further the amount of the property taken. So under this doctrine, dismissal is to harsh a penalty. First, length of service. Two, amount of the property taken. Third, perhaps, under the first offense rule. In other words, people, when you talk of dismissal, you have to consider some factors. Such as what? Length of service, amount of the property taken, first offense rule, nature of the employment status or employment, nature of the business, the totality of infractions. We have also the principle of equity. We have also the principle of compassion, charity, and understanding. All of these factors have already been applied by the Supreme Court in dismissal cases. So you have to consider this length of service. However, if the nature of the offense is so grave, then dismissal is proper. I'll give you a concrete example. Doon sa panadero sa bakery, 15 years of service, 15 pieces of pandesal. Okay, amount of the property taken negligible, length of service 15 years, first offense rule applied. But in this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that despite length of service, dismissal is proper. I'll give you a concrete example. I have an actual case. An assistant manager of the bank. She got the money of the bank. After 2 days, she replaced it. She returned the money. But in the meantime, an audit finding was already conducted, which was the basis for her dismissal. Is dismissal proper? Well, I have accepted all efforts in order to defend the rights of this client. But to no avail, we lost the case. I applied the principle of compassionate justice. I applied the length of service. I applied the rule that considering that the worker is already retirable, length of service, dismissal is too harsh a punishment. Dismissal is too harsh a penalty. But what was the pronouncement of the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court said, length of service is overshadowed by the gravity of the offense. So take note of this. Pag binigay sa baryan, if this were given in the bar, you told the very wordings of the Supreme Court. Length of service is overshadowed by the gravity of the offense. In other words, people, kahit mahaba ang serbisyo na niyan, kasi yung ginawa niya ay grabe, serious, length of service is overshadowed by the gravity of the offense. So you know now, people, the distinction of the panadero and this assistant manager who stole or got the money of the bank, although ibinalik niya yun. Another is employment position. In determining or imposing the penalty of dismissal, you have to consider also employment position. In the case of managerial employees, mere finding on the basis of loss of trust and confidence, there is sufficient basis for the dismissal of a managerial employee. Also, in the case of positions of trust and confidence of rank and file employees. Ito yung tinatawag nating fiduciary positions. Positions of trust and confidence where the workers or employees are entrusted with the protection of property and money of the employer or the company. And there was violation of such reposed trust and confidence. It will be a just cause for dismissal. It will be a justification for the dismissal of an employee. Like a cashier, property officer, auditor, accountant, teller, etc., and so on and so forth. Another. So we have length of service, employment, position, gravity of the offense, first offense rule. If it were the first offense, if the offense, if the offense committed was an isolated one, first offense, and the offense is not so grave, it's not so grave, dismissal is too harsh a penalty. So, in the case of that assistant managers who stole the money of the bank, although she has been there for almost 30 years, first offense rule will not apply. Length of service will not apply. Why? Length of service overshadows the gravity of the offense. You cannot apply also this offense, this first offense rule. Now, minor offenses, but it is repeatedly committed by the employee, would amount to serious misconduct, said the Supreme Court. Of course, you may apply here also the totality of infractions rule. So take note of these people, these factors that may, shall we say, affect the imposition of the penalty of dismissal. Nature of the business. Say, for instance, in this building, tech-type building, there was a company rule or regulation: no employees is allowed to smoke during office hours. So a worker was found to be smoking inside the company premises. He was dismissed. Is dismissal proper? You have to consider the nature of the business. Since this is a business office, no combustible materials are manufactured or stored. So the nature of the business does not require strict implementation of the no smoking rule, as the case may be. However, if the nature of the business requires strict implementation of the no smoking rule, like a gasoline station, like a gasoline depot in Pandacan, even if you were found to be smoking a non-lighted cigarette, you can be dismissed, because a slight mistake will raise down the whole establishment to the ground. A mere mistake. So you cannot claim and argue that you cannot be dismissed because you are just holding an unlighted cigarette. No. You have to consider the nature of the business, that there must be a strict enforcement of safety rules. Otherwise, the whole establishment will race down to the ground. That is the reason why dismissal is proper. So take note of these people, very important. Now, another is this principle of equity. According to the Supreme Court, considering the length of service of the worker, although he was dismissed for a cause, he can still be entitled to the payment of separation pay for some equitable grounds. In other words, the Supreme Court applied here the principle of equity. And what is equity is defined by the Supreme Court in several cases. Equity simply means justice outside the law. Remember, equity means justice outside the law. Another is this principle of compassion, understanding, and sympathy. Sometimes you read cases where the Supreme Court has to decide in favor of labor under the principle of compassion, charity, understanding, because of the fact that perhaps the only breadwinner of the family is the worker. No other means of livelihood. Perhaps his work is the only source, main livelihood of the family. So under this principle of understanding, compassion, and charity, sometimes these are applied by the Supreme Court in determining the penalty of dismissal. In other words, the penalty imposed must be proportionate to the offense committed. Under what rule? Under the proportionality rule. What is this proportionality rule? This is otherwise known as the doctrine of commensurate penalty. The doctrine of commensurate penalty. So take note of this, very important. Another. So we have this serious misconduct. Another is this willful disobedience. In willful disobedience, this is actually insubordination. But an isolated act of disobedience is not disobedience. There must be a deliberate act to disobey. And what is disobeyed is actually a rule or regulation issued by the company which is reasonable. And the rule or regulation of the company which is reasonable is related to the performance of the functions of an employee or worker. I'll give you a concrete example. In the case of a company, in the motor pool of the company, there was a company rule regulation that no company driver will take out the motor vehicle without any trip ticket. Here is a company driver who took out a company vehicle without any trip ticket. He was dismissed. Is dismissal proper? Of course. You may apply here the factors I have given you in determining, in imposing the penalty of dismissal. What are they again? We have what? Length of service, employment position, nature of the business, nature of the offense, totality of infractions, first offense rule. We have this principle of equity, the principle of understanding, compassion, etc. So in this particular case, you may apply the first offense rule. It being the first offense, dismissal is too harsh a penalty, pwede yun. But in the event that when he took out the company vehicle, he met an accident where the company vehicle burst into flames upon impact with another vehicle in a public street. Although it's an isolated case, in this particular case or instance, dismissal is proper, considering the damage, shall we say, of the company. Another is this, so we have this willful fraud, willful breach of trust, yes. Another is this gross and habitual neglect of duty. You might be misguided by this, shall we say, offense. Gross and habitual neglect of duty. It should be gross and at the same time habitual because of the conjunction and. But take note that there are cases decided by the Supreme Court where, although it's not habitual, when it is gross, it is a just cause for dismissal. And the last one is, of course, analogous commission of a criminal offense, yes, against the employer, immediate members of the family, and including managerial employees. Analogous causes. What are the analogous causes that you may think of? Well, analogous causes. Well, we have abandonment. In abandonment, take note that here there is a deliberate intent on the part of the employee not to return. Deliberate refusal to return. Deliberate intent not to return. And this should be portrayed by his overt acts. On the part of the employer should provide or notify him in his last known address. First notice as the formal charges, last notice, notice of dismissal. And what is the best evidence to prove that this notice was given to the last known address? Registered mail with return card. So take note of this. Very, very important. All right. Another. So we have this abandonment. By the way, in abandonment, it also requires what we call the two notice rule. The notice on formal charges, the notice of dismissal, or the last notice, so to speak. So, however, there is no hearing. Take note, there is no hearing in abandonment because, in the first place, you cannot find anymore the worker. He's absent. He has already abandoned his post or job. So there is no hearing, so to speak. So this is a case where there is observance of due process, to notice rule, without hearing, because it is impossible to do a thing where a worker is absent or has already abandoned his post. So no hearing here. So that is the only instance where there is no hearing, abandonment. By the way, but the two notice rule is required. Well, so we have another. We have the authorized causes. The authorized causes are initiated by the employer. Number one, we have this automation, or what we call introduction of labor-saving device. Take note that the employer can embark on an automation project or program for purposes of economy and efficient, effective management. Take note, economy and efficient and effective management. Why? Imagine people, if 100 workers are discharged, and these 100 workers are replaced by machines, one machine, and it is operated only by one person. It's a great economy on the part of the employer. Also, there is only one to supervise the money. It's one person. So take note of this. Very important. But in automation or introduction of labor-saving device, this is actually a replacement of men by machines. With the replacement of men by machines, there is an eventual economic dislocation of the workers, which will result in what we call technological unemployment. Ang tawag dyan ay technological unemployment. So, in automation, there is technological unemployment, replacement of men by machines. But the employer is required to comply with certain requirements. What are they? Number one, we have the two separate notice rule. In just causes, two notice rule. In authorized causes, two separate notice rule. What is this two separate notice rule? The two separate notice rule simply means 30-day notice to the dole and 30-day notice to the employees to be discharged on account of automation. Those two separate notice rule. Number two requirement, reasonable criteria. This was given in the bar, reasonable criteria. Tinanong sa bar, what has been asked in the bar is this: whether or not reasonable criteria is imposed by law. No. Reasonable criteria are crafted, drafted, approved by the company. It's a company policy. These are reasonable criteria. But what are some of these reasonable criteria? Like what? Like what we call performance rating, or what we call seniority rating on the basis of length of service. You may be asked in the bar the meaning of seniority. When you talk of seniority, this simply means the worker's equity to the job. The worker's equity to the job on the basis of length of service. On the basis of length of service. In other words, people, when you talk of seniority rating, it is based on length of service. We'll pause for a while for another salvo after a few minutes.